Good evening, fantasy football fans. Welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Slant, brought to you by ProFootballFocus.com and powered by DraftKings. This is Scott Spratt joining you tonight. I don't have my normal co-host, Michael Moore. I have to assume that he's off lamenting the Panthers just dismantling last night by the Steelers, as is completely appropriate. So I'm going to be flying solo tonight. That may lead to a little bit shorter podcast than usual, but I have several topics that I want to cover in depth tonight. The first I'm going to talk about is about running back effectiveness versus different defensive fronts. Then I'm going to get into some of the surprising target distributions on teams. And finally, I'm going to look at the schedule, which is a big week this week because we have the first byes. There are actually 6 teams on bye this week. So I'll try to identify some matchups you can look for, maybe in deeper leagues, at all 4 major offensive positions, so you can identify some players you may want to pick up and start this week if some of your bigger name players are on bye. But first, let's get started with the running backs. If you haven't been following my articles this year on ProFootballFocus.com Fantasy, maybe you don't have a Fantasy Gold subscription, which, by the way, I totally recommend that you purchase, but we don't all have the money to do that. I've been writing about running back effectiveness versus defensive fronts, or the number of men in the box defensively against those running backs. When I was looking at this over the offseason preparing, I found that there was quite a big distribution here, a big difference depending on how many men are in the box against a given running back. Just looking league-wide over the last 5 years, when a running back faces an 8-man box, he only averages 2.3 yards per carry. When he faces 7 men in the box, that jumps to 4.2 yards per carry. And with 6 men in the box, it's 4.7. And the fewer or more men you get in the box, the more extreme those totals get. So it really makes a big difference, just the defense that a running back is facing. And based on that, I've created a statistic that I call FAE, which is front adjusted yards over expectations, which basically tells you what is a running back's yards per carry given the expectations they should have for the number of men they're facing in the box. It's a little bit better in my mind than yards per carry because some backs face sort of extreme defenses. Maybe they're always in heavy running situations. Frank Gore was sort of the key man in this last year. Last year, he faced at least 7 men in the box over 90% of the time, which is way higher than average for a typical running back. So it sort of throws into perspective how effective he was last year and has been through a lot of his career on San Francisco, which is a more run-heavy and predictable team to face. But especially when you have more distributed roles nowadays. I mean, you don't have the workhorse backs as much as you have guys that handle third down duties or maybe come into the game because of their blocking prowess. Those guys don't always have the same distribution of defenses that maybe the first and second down back has. And that can sort of create some problems, I guess, in identifying which backs have been more effective because the situations haven't been equal. So looking at that stat FAE that I've created, I want to look at some of the guys that have been very positive this year and very negative and spin that forward in fantasy on what I recommend that you do with that information. So let's start at the top of the list with some of the backs that have performed very well in FAE. The leading back is probably a little surprise to most of you that have been watching the NFL so far this season. It's Le'Veon Bell, who, as I mentioned last night, was part of the unbelievable running performance in particular that the Steelers had against the Panthers, who traditionally have been a very strong running defense under Ron Rivera, but last night gave up more than 250 yards on the ground, with Bell being the primary beneficiary there. And obviously, his really long run last night, I think he had about a 60 or 70-yard gain from deep in the Steelers' own territory. That's going to skew the results a little bit, but he still has 75 FAE on the season and 53 carries, which is a huge improvement over last year when he was in minus 184 FAE. In my mind, just looking at him visually, you can tell that the weight loss, and he lost maybe 20 to 30 pounds over the offseason, it's really added a lot of burst to his game. And you can see that translating into other stats as well. His 3.13 yards after contact per attempt is second best among qualified backs this season. So he just looks like a much improved player in terms of actual skills this year. And given the number of catches that he's always going to be fielding, especially paired with LeGarrette Blount in that backfield, a guy that's not going to come in and take away his catches, I think Bell is extremely safe as a top 5 running back. And in my mind, he's actually moved to number 2. So he's passed along guys like Jamal Charles that are injured. He's passed LaShawn McCoy, who I'll talk about in a little bit. The one man that I still have Bell behind is actually DeMarco Murray, who is my number 1 back now in both redraft and dynasty formats. Murray is up to 65 FAE on 75 carries this year and has 3.59 yards after contact per attempt. That's the best among qualified backs. To me, Murray just looks explosive. I've really liked what I've seen from Dallas's offensive line. There are not really a lot of backs that have been really strong in this measurement here. So when I get to some of the other names, I think it's going to really show you how dominant Murray has been this year. Not to mention he's actually leading the league in carries. So just the combination of usage and effectiveness this year, I think makes Murray. I mean, the one thing that you might have questions about are his health, but for me, just the actual skills and the success that he's had in 3 weeks, it's enough that I'm buying in just in all formats. And, if you have someone like LaShawn McCoy and some of the other bad names that I'm going to get to in a little bit that are not doing as well by this stat, they may be players that you should go ahead and try to trade for Murray, who may still be acquirable given his injury history. Okay, some other points here, some guys that have positive FAE totals. Justin Forsett still at 59 FAE on 29 carries. That's 2.0 FAE per carry. That's a little bit better than rookie Lorenzo Taliaferro, 1.3, who had a very successful debut this week. But I think a lot of people are going to probably take Taliaferro's performance here as a sign that he's going to be the takeover back in this offense. And I think that Forsett is going to have a role in any case. It's going to depend a little bit about the game situations as whether or not Forsett or the heavy back is going to be in. But I think Taliaferro went a long way into establishing himself as the potential first and second down back, whereas Bernard Pierce has just 0.1 FAE per carry this season. So obviously limited sample sizes at play here, but Taliaferro has been the more effective heavy back than Pierce so far. I do still think Pierce is going to have the first chance coming back, and I would probably play him ahead of all three of these, all the Ravens this week against the Panthers, actually, who, again, were exposed on the run defense side. Maybe not as scary a matchup as you would originally expected before that Steelers game. But it's a little bit of a murky situation here. I would definitely pick up Taliaferro in deeper leagues, though, and don't drop Justin Forsett at this point either. Okay, next up, Ahmad Bradshaw up to 44 FAE on just 24 carries this year. He has obviously been the better back than Trent Richardson. I think that's soon, if not already, going to be reflected in pretty much everyone's rankings. But if it isn't, I think Bradshaw clear top 30 back. Richardson, to me, outside the top 40 for the rest of the season. So I think Bradshaw could potentially still be a sneaky add in some shallower formats where people haven't added him. He's been very good so far. Darren Sproles, 41 FAE on just 17 carries this year. Again, buoyed by a really long run. I think that was in week 2. But he has been so much better than LaShawn McCoy. Now, this is the real surprise last year. McCoy, who was number 2 in FAE last year, is the second worst this year at minus 87 FAE on 60 carries. I'm not sure what's going on up there in Philadelphia. McCoy has not been an effective player like he was last year. And for me, it seems like Sproles has just been the more effective player all around and is certainly eating into the workload a little bit. 60 carries in 3 weeks is plenty for McCoy to be a number 1 running back, but the performance just hasn't been there. And I question whether he's a top 5 back clearly anymore. I'm still going to be ranking him that way for the time being, but I'm definitely at least worried about McCoy, and Sproles I love as a top 20 back the rest of the season. A couple other small hits here. Lamar Miller up to 41 FAE on 36 carries this year. He'll be very effective for the Dolphins the rest of the way this season, even if no Sean Moreno comes back. Bobby Rainey, 32 FAE on 37 carries. A long run here, but I think the more important point is that Doug Martin has been really terrible by this measurement. Even in his rookie season, when he was a top 10 back overall, negative 42 FAE, other than that 4-touchdown Week 9 performance against the Raiders. So I think I'm beginning to question whether Rainey was ever a good player at all. And for me, Rainey is the clear back that you want in this offense, such as you want any. I think that Rainey could potentially be a flex-worthy back for the next several weeks. And I kind of expect him to establish himself as the primary back and may sort of work his way into the top 20 down the line if the offense moves that way. All right, let's move on to some of the backs that have not performed as well by FAE. Again, that's front-adjusted yards over expectations. So performance given the defensive front that a back is facing. The worst performer here may not be much of a surprise after the San Diego Chargers game last week. It's Donald Brown, down to negative 92 FAE on 39 carries. This may have really been matchup-specific. Almost all of his work so far has been against that stout Buffalo run defense, but you certainly didn't like what you saw there, especially given that Brown was such a positive influence pretty much in all of the advanced measures last year. I think he led all qualified backs in yards after contact per attempt last year, was just unbelievable and really looked like a good ad for the Chargers this year. Meanwhile, Matthews already down. Danny Woodhead looks like he is going to be out for the year with a broken leg. So Brown, he got 30-plus carries in this last game. He's going to probably get a lot of work in the next 4 weeks or so if he can hold up to it. but I'm a little bit concerned about his lack of effectiveness there. I have to imagine that the Chargers are going to be working in other backs to maybe keep him a little bit healthier. They may even sign a player this week. But for now, Brown's getting a heavy workload, but I'm not sure about the actual talent itself. I already hit on McCoy, the minus 87 fay there. The next player, though, another probably big surprise, especially for players that have only been looking at fantasy production so far, Giovanni Bernard, negative 61 fay on 55 carries. Bernard has an unbelievable 67 touches so far this season, which puts him on pace for 350 touches this year. That's pretty good for a guy that people think of as sort of a shared backfield guy, a guy that's a little bit undersized for the position. But the negative 61 fay, it troubles me. He actually hasn't been very effective. It's the volume that's driven his fantasy success so far. Compare that to his backfield mate Jeremy Hill with 20 fay on 25 carries. So Hill has been the more effective back in a limited opportunity so far this year. I think the workload is going to continue to skew that way, where I sort of expect long-term Bernard to have maybe 60% of the carries in the backfield, but an overwhelming majority of the touches, just because of the catches there that he's going to get. And I really don't see Bernard as having any risk of falling outside the top 10 at the position. So it's sort of a relative thing there. But if you're looking to maybe potentially make an upgrade, he might be a player that I would look to be trading to acquire DeMarco Murray at this point. Bernard doesn't have an injury history, so people might be more comfortable with him, especially given the increase in workload. But I think I definitely prefer Murray the rest of the way. Next up, Monte Ball, negative 53 fay on 49 carries this year. Very poor performance so far for Ball. That's shown up in the fantasy numbers as well. Now, we've seen backs with poor fay totals be effective in Peyton Manning offenses. Just look last year at Noshawn Moreno, negative 108 fay for the season. So Moreno was obviously a hugely successful back in fantasy, even if he wasn't a perfect back by this measurement. But Ball is on pace to more than double that. So I'm questioning whether Ball is an effective player. There hasn't really been any threats to his workload, and I'm not sure that Denver really has the horses to bring in somebody to spell Ball or really take away his starting job at all. But I just don't think you can expect Ball to put up the numbers that Moreno did last year. I just don't think Ball is as good a player. And it seems like Denver's offense may be a little slower this year, if only because the schedule is a little bit more difficult than the previous season. Okay, finally, another player, and this is the one that you're probably ready to hit the panic on. It's Eddie Lacy, negative 48 fay on 36 carries. Obviously, the matchups have been really tough the first 3 weeks, but it's a little disheartening to see him at negative 48 when James Starks has 5 fay on 15 carries. And Lacy, negative 90 last year, was really covered up by the 11 touchdowns. But this is a little bit of a Noshawn Moreno situation where Lacy really benefited last year from being in a high-powered offense with Aaron Rodgers. Meanwhile, the Packers haven't looked good at all offensively so far this season. So if the Packers themselves are falling back down to earth a little bit, I think that's a troublesome sign for Lacy. So, Lacy is somebody that I'd obviously be looking to sell at this point. It could be pretty difficult to maybe get an asset, but I think you want to look to trade him for any back that's still in the top 15. Maybe an Andre Ellington might be a player that you could acquire for Lacy that also hasn't had a lot of success so far, but somebody that I expect to actually produce going forward. All right, the next topic I want to get to is a target breakdown. Now that we're 3 weeks into the season, I think it's a pretty good time to take a look at which offenses are keying in on certain receivers and which are maybe throwing passes with a distribution that's a little unexpected so far this year. And so I'm just going to go team by team with some of the teams that I found most interesting in this respect and hit a bunch of teams and just talk a little bit about each of them. Let's start with the Cardinals. This is probably not a new story for many involved. We got Michael Floyd with 22 targets so far this season, Larry Fitzgerald with 20, but the introduction of rookie John Brown has 15 targets so far this season. So really you have 3 players here that are splitting the workload there, plus you have Ellington, a very capable receiving back. It makes it really hard for any of those players to emerge as a top 20 wide receiver, but especially Fitzgerald, which at least for me was the one I had the highest expectations for. Not surprisingly, Floyd has an average depth of target of 21.7 yards, whereas Fitzgerald is under 11 at 10.6 yards. For Fitzgerald to be the most effective receiver in this offense, he needed to out-touch Floyd significantly because he's the guy playing in the slot. He's the one that needs the heavy target load. And I think that Brown has really taken some of that a little bit away from him. So in my mind, it's cleared up that Floyd is the number 1 receiver that you want in this offense, but I'm not even sure Floyd is a top 25 receiver either. That might actually throw all 3 players outside the top 30, which would generally be good news for a quarterback, but until Carson Palmer gets back and healthy, I'm not sure that's there either. It might be a little bit of a stay away from everybody in this offense for the time being, although it looks like the Cardinals are going to be a good team in real life. In fantasy, the translation just isn't there. All right, next up, Baltimore. This has been one of the major surprises so far this season, I would say. Steve Smith, 32 targets. Torrey Smith, 16 targets. So Steve Smith has twice as many so far as Torrey. I mean, that's pretty huge. To me, it's clear that Steve Smith is the one that's emerged as the number one option on this team. I actually ranked him 12th last week for the weekly rankings, and I don't see any reason why Steve Smith can't be a top 15 receiver the rest of the way, given the attention he's getting. Additionally, the Ravens look like they've lost Dennis Pitta for the year with a repeat hip injury, which is really sad for him, but it doesn't seem like that's going to hurt Steve Smith's value at all. Unfortunately, I don't really think that's going to help Torrey Smith's value either. You might have been putting that 2 and 2 together in your head because Torrey Smith had his biggest target year ever last year when Dennis Pitta missed most of the season. But Torrey Smith actually had 40 targets in his first 4 games last year. That was with Pitta on the team, 10 targets a game. That dropped to 7.25 targets per game, 87 targets over the last 12 games without Pitta for Torrey Smith. So I don't think losing Pitta helps Torrey Smith at all. The guy that it really helps is Owen Daniels, the backup tight end, who actually has already scored twice. So already had a little bit of value there, but he's available in a lot of leagues. So I think that's someone that you can plug and play in maybe a little bit deeper format, 12 or 14 team league at tight end. If you lost Pitta or if you lost Kyle Rudolph, who also is going to be out for several weeks, that's a name to look at. We'll get to some of those other options in a bit, but the major point here is that I really think Torrey Smith is basically droppable in 10 and 12 team leagues. It's not a requirement that you drop him, but I don't see him as a top 40 receiver. And Steve Smith, I definitely see as a top 15 receiver the rest of the way. Next up, we've got Buffalo. Week 1 was a little bit of a surprise, a red herring situation here for Sammy Watkins, who didn't really do much. But since then has been the primary target for the Bills. And so far this season, Watkins has 23 targets. And wide receivers and tight ends not named Sammy Watkins only have 36 targets. So Watkins is more or less getting 40% of all the targets for this team. And while E.J. Manuel is not really an effective passer, and it's a bit of a conservative offense, obviously, very run-heavy with 2 and at times 3 fantasy-relevant running backs, Watkins is getting enough of the work on the team that even if the team doesn't throw the ball that often and doesn't throw the ball downfield, I think Watkins can be effective. It actually looks like a pretty successful wide receiver rookie season so far, which isn't a huge surprise given the amount of talent and the depth of talent at the position, but there have been a lot of fluctuations, at least in my mind, over which wide receiver rookies were the ones to own for this season only. And I was a little down on Watkins originally, but with the injury to Marcus Lee and some inconsistencies elsewhere, I think Watkins is clearly in that class with Kelvin Benjamin and Brandon Cooks. And those are really the only 3 rookie wide receivers I think you're looking at as top 40 plays. But I definitely think Watkins is there and really the only wide receiver or tight end in Buffalo that you want to be starting right now. Denver, we don't really know a lot about the situation yet because Wes Welker's only been back for 1 week. And again, that was against the Seahawks, so it's not sure if that was a characteristic performance there. Although the Broncos did pretty well to move the ball there. But so far, Emmanuel Sanders, 33 targets to Demaryius Thomas, 27 targets. That's not actually because Sanders has been the slot receiver. He's only run 48.7% of his routes in the slot. It's a pretty low number. And with Welker back, I really don't see Sanders as an inside receiver much at all this season. I think Welker's going to be there. And Sanders has been effective on the outside. He actually has an 11.8 yard average depth of target this season, which is higher than Demaryius Thomas at 8.0. So I think Sanders is a clear top 20 wide receiver the rest of the way. I think Demaryius Thomas is probably hurt, which is why he hasn't performed very well so far. But we're not going to continue to see all of the touchdowns in the offense move towards Julius Thomas. And Demaryius Thomas is just so much bigger than Sanders that even if he has a target discrepancy there, he'll make up for it over the long term in terms of touchdowns. So not worried at all about Demaryius Thomas as a top 5 receiver, even though I think he may be a little hurt right now. But Emmanuel Sanders in the top 20 for me. We'll have to see how Welker stacks up in the coming weeks, but right now he's a top 30 receiver for me as well. Houston, this one's been really interesting for me, especially as a huge DeAndre Hopkins fan this season. Andre Johnson has 24 targets, and Hopkins has 18 so far. So it's been a little bit more balanced than I think a lot of people expected, although the targets for both players, or neither player, is really that high. Johnson has 8.4 average depth of target so far. Hopkins 12.6. To me, Hopkins looks like the more explosive playmaker. And even though he's a little bit smaller than Johnson, he's the real touchdown threat in my mind because of the leaping ability and because of the explosiveness on big plays down the field. We've never really seen Andre Johnson have a successful touchdown season. He's never reached 10 touchdowns, or he maybe has once. But Hopkins is the guy I think to own actually in this offense going forward. They're both probably top 20 receivers, and Hopkins I think can be had for much less than that right now. So that's definitely a player that I'm looking to acquire right now for some of the lower-end wide receiver options. I wouldn't trade Andre Johnson straight up for Hopkins. Andre Johnson is probably a little bit safer, given the number of targets. It's probably going to be a little bit more. In other words, in-game floor is a little bit higher. But I think you can probably package and get Hopkins. Like you can take Johnson and get Hopkins plus. So that might be something you want to look at. You don't have to focus on Andre Johnson being in the deal. Just Hopkins is a guy I think you should trade for as a top 25 wide receiver, probably expecting a little bit more even, but you can get him for value outside the top 30. All right, Minnesota. This has been a little bit interesting so far. Cordero Patterson has salvaged a lot of his value with his rushing production, which probably isn't going to stop. But Greg Jennings has actually gotten more targets so far this year, 19 to 15. I don't really want to get carried away here because it looks like Teddy Bridgewater is going to be the starter going forward, at least based on the injury situation as I understand it. And I think that could change a lot for the offense. But right now, Patterson hasn't gotten the target load of even a top 30 receiver. I'm still going to be ranking him there, at least for now, until I see how it unfolds with Bridgewater. But I'm at least a little bit nervous there. And I think that means that Jennings also has a little bit of deep league value as well. New Orleans, this has been a pretty big surprise for me. I sort of expected the Breeze and to spread the ball around like they always have been doing it. That actually hasn't been happening so far this year. Obviously, Jimmy Graham has gotten a lot of work, 31 targets so far this year, leads the team. But Brandon Cooks, 23, Marcus Colston, 13, and shut out week 2 in terms of targets. So it hasn't really improved since then either. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that there are 2 receivers getting the bulk of the work here. And that's what means to me that Cooks is totally a startable player. He's borderline top 30 at the position. He probably is there, but there's quite a few guys that fall in sort of that flex range. And the good news is I think a lot of them are more valuable than the flex range running backs right now. So I'd feel totally good about starting Cooks or Sammy Watkins, for instance, over maybe the 23rd ranked running back right now. So they're going to have a lot of value in leagues, even if Brandon Cooks isn't a top 30 receiver. But right now I think he probably is, and he's clearly the option you want in New Orleans. I would probably be looking to sell Marcus Colston right now. I'm not sure he's going to have much value. People have been sort of waiting for this to happen the last couple of seasons. But the touchdown last week makes his fantasy total look a little bit better. I would definitely prefer Cooks going forward. Next up, the Giants. The Giants had a huge fantasy week, Victor Cruz especially last week. But so far for the season, Larry Donald, 23 targets, Victor Cruz, 22, and even Ruben Randle, 19 targets. This has been a lot more distributed than I think a lot of people expected coming into the season. Obviously, Donald coming out of nowhere at tight end. And for me, Donald is clearly a top 10 tight end the rest of the way. Even with the lack of explosiveness, it looks like he's going to get 70 catches plus this season. So, I mean, that's pretty solid for the position. Cruz, even with the huge performance here, hard to call him a top 25 receiver the rest of the way. Randall has potential, but again, the distribution of workload here, it reminds me a little bit of the Cardinals, where I'm wondering whether any of the receivers are going to be trustworthy if Eli's spreading the ball around this much. Although it could mean a little bit of a renaissance for Eli, so that'll be interesting to see going forward. In contrast, the NFC East mates, the Eagles, they have not been distributed at all. Jeremy Maclin's gotten 31 targets compared to 33 combined for backups Matthews and Cooper. So to me, Maclin clearly the number 1 target on the team. Sleeper Zach Ertz, 13 targets. Actually not a bad total for tight ends, but not at all threatening to Maclin. Maclin clearly the number 1 receiver on the team. Could have had probably 225 yards and 2 touchdowns in that blowout game, the big scoring game against the Redskins over the weekend. But he had a huge play called back earlier in the game. I think I was just extremely wrong on this offense. Foles hasn't really impressed me, but they're just moving the ball so much that I think the fantasy points are there. And Maclin, he just clearly has emerged the number 1 receiver here. So he's a borderline top 10 receiver the rest of the way, clearly top 15 in my mind. So I don't think you could do it, but maybe look to trade either of the Arizona wide receivers for Macklin at this point. I'm not sure everyone's back in, but for me, Macklin clearly a top 15 receiver. In San Diego, it's been a disappointing start to the season for Keenan Allen owners. He has just 17 targets so far this year, which is fewer than Eddie Royal, who has 20. And actually, Antonio Gates and Ladarius Green have combined for 25. So if you can count the tight ends as sort of a collective, then Allen has been the number 3 receiver on the team in terms of usage. So that doesn't really bode well going forward. I think there was a little bit of concern coming into the season that the Chargers had little else to work with last year besides Allen. Malcolm Floyd was hurt for most of the year. He has 10 targets so far this year. But it's looking like this is a pretty distributed offense. That's probably good news for Phillip Rivers, but I think Allen's a player that you want to sell. Maybe try to trade him for Jeremy Macklin now. That may be an option for you. Probably not in the top 20 for me going forward. Although in dynasty leagues, I'm still very bullish on Allen. I just think he's a very solid route runner and has a pretty high floor, all things considered, this year. The touchdowns will come a little bit later as well. Next up, we've got the San Francisco 49ers. This was a team I was really worried about coming into the year because I thought there was a lot of overlap in terms of role. And while that hasn't really been a problem in fantasy for Michael Crabtree owners so far, it sort of shows up in the target distribution. Crabtree has 22 targets so far this year to Anquan Bolden's 20, and Stevie Johnson with a surprising 15. That might have a little bit to do with Vernon Davis missing a little bit of time. Vernon Davis has 9 in 2 games so far, but to me, that's a lot of distribution to be counting on Crabtree as a top 20 receiver, and he scored twice this year, which has bailed it out a little bit. But now might be a time to try to sell. I think I would definitely prefer Jeremy Macklin over him if you could acquire him right now. Maybe a player to get rid of right there. It's also a team that's been a little pass heavier than I expected, and given the talent they have in their backfield, I kind of think they're going to be going a little bit more run heavy going forward as well. Another reason that you could potentially sell Crabtree now. Next up, Seattle. I think after week 1, we saw them in the NFL opener. Percy Harvin looked like such a dynamic player. We were all ready for him to be a top 10 receiver. But Harvin has just 17 targets so far this year. Not only is that a really low total, but it's only one more than Doug Baldwin. So it doesn't really look like Harvin is asserting himself. It's reminiscent of Cordero Patterson, the player that came in to replace him in Minnesota. And again, with Harvin, the rushing production can potentially buoy him even with a lower target threshold. But given that Harvin gets such a short average depth of target, he's always targeted at or around the line of scrimmage. He's in an offense that's extremely run-heavy and has had health problems in the past. It seems really difficult to trust him as a top 20 receiver for now. So it's another player that you might be looking to sell for the time being. And then finally, let's look at Tennessee here. Tennessee has been a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde team in real life, and that's shown up a bit in fantasy. But last year, Kendall Wright was maybe one of the bigger surprises with most receptions last year. He has just 22 targets so far this year compared to 21 for Justin Hunter, 15 for Nate Washington, and 25 for Delaney Walker. Walker's the guy that you really want in fantasy right now in this offense. 25 targets is a ton for a tight end so far this season. So he looks like a very clear top 10 player at the position. Again, he's available in some leagues too. So for those that lost Kyle Rudolph or lost Dennis Pitta, definitely look at Walker. I would look at him first. I'd rather have him than, say, Antonio Gates as well, among some of the other guys in that range. So I think that's a player to look at. But Wright's lack of target load here, I think that makes him difficult to start as a top 40 receiver for the time being. He's a guy that has a very low average depth of target, again, playing almost exclusively from the slot. Hunter is the guy that has the touchdown upside. And I think the 21 targets is actually a pretty good sign for him earlier this year. Last year, Nate Washington had 3 times as many snaps as Hunter for the season. So you're hoping that Locker can get it turned around a little bit or that they make a switch at quarterback. And for me, I think Hunter's upside is such that I prefer him to write the rest of the season despite the lack of consistency. Okay, final topic. Again, this is week 4 we're coming into, and it's going to be the first week of the season with buys. So I'm going to look a little bit at the schedule here to look for some guys that maybe you can pick up to start over the guys that they're going to have to bench because they're on buys this week. To start with, the week 4 buys are the Cincinnati Bengals. You got Cleveland, Denver, St. Louis, Arizona, and Seattle. So that means that for quarterbacks, you're going to lose Andy Dalton, Peyton Manning, and Russell Wilson. At running back, you're going to lose Giovanni Bernard, Terrence West, and Isaiah Crowell, Monte Ball, Zach Stacy, Andre Ellington, and Marshawn Lynch. I mean, that's a devastating loss of running backs there. That's a lot of guys in the top 20, 25 range. The wide receiver, you're going to lose A.J. Green, Demarius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders, Wes Welker, Larry Fitzgerald, and Michael Floyd. Again, maybe not a huge hit given how they played so far, but a lot of people relying on them in leagues. And then Percy Harvin as well. And then finally, at tight end, you're going to lose Julius Thomas and Jordan Cameron. So I looked a little bit at the schedule here to come up with some of the guys that I think could be viable replacements. At quarterback, this guy's probably owned and started in every league, and if he's not, he should be. But Phillip Rivers wasn't necessarily drafted as a top 10 quarterback, so in shallow formats, maybe he's available, or maybe he's a backup for somebody, and maybe you can acquire him in a trade. But he's facing Jacksonville this week. They've allowed the most passing yards so far this season, so Rivers will probably be a top 5 quarterback for me. Tony Romo, he's actually a little bit more available in most leagues. He's facing New Orleans. They've allowed the 4th most passing yards so far this season, so really like Romo this week. Playing a little bit with fire here, but Jake Locker, he's facing Indianapolis, who've allowed the 5th most passing yards this season. Locker's been a little bit mistake-prone early in the season, but I think this is a matchup that he can really benefit. And this is probably borderline top 15. I don't think we're going to be aggressive ranking Locker anymore, even in his better matchups. That burned a little bit in the Dallas Cowboys start a couple games ago. But I think Locker can be a nice plug-and-play here for players in deeper formats that don't really have anybody available in, say, the top 20 overall quarterbacks. Among running backs, the Cush matchup for me is always Oakland. And Lamar Miller is obviously the player that you want there. He'll be available in most leagues. But Daniel Thomas is probably out there in every league. Thomas got signed sort of last minute as a lot of the Miami running backs have gone down with injuries. And for me, it was a little bit of a surprise that he clearly passed Damian Williams on the depth chart immediately. So Thomas is someone that I could see potentially getting 10 to 15 touches this week if Miami can handle their business against Oakland. So in a very deep league, I would look at Thomas as a potential plug-and-play there. A more palatable matchup here, you got Donald Brown against Jacksonville. Again, I'm not thrilled by the way Brown looked last week, but the Jacksonville matchup is just so much better than that the Bills matchup. Jacksonville's allowed the most rushing yards this season, so I think you can start Brown with confidence. Fred Jackson playing Houston, they've allowed the 6th most rushing yards this year. And Ahmad Bradshaw is playing Tennessee, the 7th most. And I'm not sure everybody's quite on board yet with Bradshaw being the clear number 1 back there in Indianapolis, but he is for me. And the fact that he's on the field so much as a pass catcher, that's an offense that's going to be pass dominated. That's going to give Bradshaw opportunities that Richardson may not have as many of. And so I think I prefer Bradshaw clearly over Richardson the rest of the way. And he's going to probably be a top 20 starter for me this week, given all the buys and all the other problems other running backs have had. I think he's got a totally safe start this week. So if he's out in your league, pick him up for the long run, but definitely pick him up to start this week. Okay, wide receivers. Not as many interesting matchups here, but I've got some good deeper league options. We have Eddie Royal. Again, he's got more targets this year than I'm blanking on his name, but the number 1, Keenan Allen, the presumed number 1 receiver for the Chargers, and they're facing Jacksonville. That's the worst pass defense as well as the worst run defense so far this year. I mean, obviously they've been really bad, so Royal could be a sneaky start there. You have Anquan Bolden facing off against Philadelphia, who've allowed the 3rd most passing yards this year. He's the guy that's probably more available. Crabtree is the presumed number 1 target there, but the pass distribution hasn't really sort of gone that way so far, and I think the touchdowns are what have sort of leaned it in Crabtree's favor. I think Bolden's a guy that you might want to start as a top 30 to 35 wide receiver this week. Terrence Williams of Dallas is facing New Orleans. The player that might benefit the most from that Cush matchup for Tony Romo is a player that's out there in some leagues. And then you've got Kendall Wright and Justin Hunter versus Indianapolis, who've allowed the 5th most passing yards. If you need the safer play, I think Wright at least going to have 5 catches this week, but Hunter, a lot of potential here for long touchdowns. I think I'm comfortable starting either in deeper formats this week given the bye situation. And finally, tight ends. I don't really think you need to look at the schedule right now because of a lot of the flux in the early season tight ends. You have a lot of guys that are still available that to me are top 10 options the rest of the way. I mentioned Delaney Walker. He's still available in 18% of Yahoo leagues. Pick him up if you need tight ends. Really, I mean, he's borderline top 8 at this point. So I think I would definitely pick him up, maybe drop some disappointments like Jason Witten or some of your injured players. Niles Paul still available in 47% of leagues. I think he's pretty safe to play this week. Jordan Reed probably going to need at least 1 more week, maybe more. So that makes Paul an attractive play there. Larry Donnell available in even more leagues, 60%. For players that need a tight end for the long term, definitely look at Donald first over Paul anyway, because I feel like his target volume is a little bit safer, even though he's a little bit less of a dynamic player, especially in PPR formats. Donald can be a real asset, maybe a top 10 tight end the rest of the way. Meanwhile, Travis Kelce available in 52% of leagues. He scored again last week. He's getting on the field more and more as the team realizes they need athletic playmakers, so I expect that trend to continue for Kelce the rest of the way. I think he's a borderline top 10 tight end. And then finally, Owen Daniels, available in 73% of leagues. With Dennis Pitta's injury, for me, he's the guy that's really out there in all formats that is the one that's going to benefit most from that injury and probably be the number one pickup in a lot of deeper formats. All right. I hope you enjoyed me flying solo this week. Michael Moore will be back next week, and hopefully it'll be a little bit more interesting then. But I want to thank you for making it this far and for listening to the Fantasy Slant, and we will catch you next week. Enjoy your week 4.